No one wants me, but I can raise your child. The autumn wind swept through Dry Creek like a cold promise of the winter to come. Martha wiped the sweat from her brow as she hauled another bucket of water from the well, her arms aching with the familiar strain. Around her, the women of the town gathered near the general store, their voices carrying on the crisp air, sharp, cutting whispers that always seemed to find her ears. "Poor thing," one said, not bothering to lower her voice. "No man will ever look at her twice." "Her father should have sent her east to family," another added. "At least there she wouldn't be such a burden on the town." Martha's cheeks burned, but she kept her head down, focusing on the weight of the bucket, the crunch of dirt beneath her boots, anything but the words that had followed her since childhood. She was used to it by now, the sideways glances, the barely concealed laughter, the way mothers pulled their sons away when she passed. In Dry Creek, where survival meant strength and beauty meant worth, Martha had learned early that she possessed neither in the eyes of her neighbors. She returned to her father's modest cabin at the edge of town, setting the bucket down with a heavy thud. Her father, weathered and tired from years working the silver mine, barely looked up from his supper. "They talkin' again?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "When aren't they?" Martha replied, forcing a smile. "Don't trouble yourself, Papa. Words can't hurt me any more." But they could, and they did. Each day felt like a battle against an invisible enemy. The judgment, the rejection, the constant reminder that she was unwanted. Yet Martha had learned to armor herself with kindness, to find purpose in the small acts of service that others overlooked. She baked bread for the widow Thompson, mended clothes for the miners' children, and tended the small garden that kept her and her father fed through the harsh winters. It was on one of her walks to gather firewood 3 days before the first snow that Martha heard the crying. At first, she thought it was an animal, a wounded fox perhaps, or a trapped rabbit. But as she pushed through the dense pines at the forest's edge, following the sound deeper into the shadows, she found something else entirely. Huddled beneath a fallen log, wrapped in nothing but a thin, torn blanket, was a child. Martha's breath caught in her throat. The boy couldn't have been more than 3 years old, his face streaked with dirt and tears, his small body shaking with cold and fear, his eyes, wide and blue as a summer sky, fixed on her with desperate hope. "Oh, sweet child," Martha whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. "What happened to you? Where's your mama?" The boy didn't answer. Perhaps he couldn't. He simply reached out his tiny hands toward her, and something in Martha's chest cracked open. Without hesitation, she scooped him into her arms, wrapping him in her own wool shawl. He was so light, so fragile, like a bird fallen from its nest. "Don't you worry," she murmured against his dirty hair. "I've got you now. You're safe." She carried him back to town as quickly as her legs would manage, her mind racing. Whose child was this? Had there been an accident? A wagon attack? But as she reached the main street, calling out for help, the responses she received chilled her more than the autumn wind. "That's the Calloway boy," old Mrs. Henderson said, her face pinched with distaste. "His mother died birthing him, and his father lit out for California 2 months back. Left the boy with his sister, but she ran off with a gambler last week. Someone needs to take him to the orphanage in Silver Falls," another woman added. "Poor creature, won't last long without proper care." "Silver Falls is a 3-day ride," Martha protested, clutching the boy tighter. "And winter's coming. He won't survive the journey." "Then what do you suggest?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her eyebrow raised. "You going to take him in? A girl in your situation? How would you feed him? Care for him?" The words hung in the air like an accusation. Martha felt the familiar heat of shame rising in her cheeks, but then she looked down at the boy in her arms. He had stopped crying, his small hand clutching the fabric of her dress, his eyes watching her with absolute trust. "Yes," Martha said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'll take him. I'll care for him." The women exchanged glances, some pitying, some scornful, all doubtful. But Martha didn't wait for their approval. She turned and walked back to her cabin, the boy secure in her arms, her decision made. Her father, when she explained the situation, simply nodded. "You've got a good heart, daughter, too good for this town, but a child needs more than heart, needs food, warmth, protection. Winter's coming hard." "We'll manage," Martha insisted. "We always do." But managing proved harder than she'd anticipated. The boy, whom she named Samuel after her late brother, needed everything. New clothes, which Martha sewed by candlelight, extra food, which meant smaller portions for herself and her father, medicine for the cough he'd developed from his nights in the cold. The town's charity, never generous, dried up completely. "You made your choice," the shopkeeper told her when she tried to buy supplies on credit. "Don't expect the rest of us to pay for your foolishness." Martha swallowed her pride and her anger. She took in more mending, more washing, worked her fingers raw trying to earn enough to keep Samuel fed and warm. But it was never quite enough. Her father gave what he could from his meager mine wages, but the silver veins were running thin, and so was their luck. It was during one of her desperate trips to gather pine nuts and winter herbs in the forest that she first encountered him, the mountain man. She'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Dry Creek had. A massive, solitary figure who lived somewhere high in the peaks, coming to town only twice a year to trade furs and venison for supplies. Some said he was a former soldier haunted by war. Others whispered he'd killed a man and fled to the wilderness to escape the law. The children called him the Beast of Bear Mountain, and mothers used his name to frighten their young ones into obedience. Martha had never given the tales much thought, until she rounded a bend in the trail and walked straight into him. She gasped, stumbling backward, her basket of herbs scattering across the ground. He stood before her like something carved from the mountain itself, tall and broad, wrapped in furs and leather, his face hidden behind a thick, dark beard. His eyes, though, were what stopped her retreat. They weren't cruel or wild as the story suggested. They were merely watchful, careful, with a sadness that seemed deeper than the valleys below. "You're far from town," he said, his voice rough from disuse, but not unkind. I was gathering herbs," Martha managed, her heart hammering. "For the boy. He has a cough." Something flickered across the man's face. "The orphan, I heard." "He's not an orphan," Martha said quickly, defensively. "He's mine now. I'm caring for him." The mountain man studied her for a long moment, then bent down and began collecting her scattered herbs, placing them carefully back in her basket. His hands, she noticed, were scarred and weathered, but surprisingly gentle. "Mullein," he said, holding up one of the plants. "Good for coughs. But you need coltsfoot, too. Grows near the stream about a mile north. And honey, if you can get it." "I can't afford honey," Martha admitted. then felt her cheeks burn at the confession. He straightened, handing her the basket. "There's a hollow oak 1/2 mile west of here. Wild bees nest there. Take what you need, but leave plenty for them to survive winter. Smoke them out gentle, and they won't bother you much." Before Martha could respond, could even thank him, he turned and disappeared into the forest, moving with surprising silence for a man so large. She stood there for a long moment, confused and oddly moved by the strange encounter. Then she followed his directions and found both the colt's foot and the bee tree, just as he'd said. That night, as she dripped honey into warm water for Samuel, her father asked about the herbs. "Where'd you learn to find those?" he questioned. "That's mountain medicine, not town knowledge." Martha hesitated, then told him about the encounter. Her father's expression grew serious. "That'd be Ethan Cole," he said quietly. "Used to work the mines years back. Had a wife and baby daughter. Loved them fierce. Then one winter, while he was away hunting, fire took the cabin. Took them both. They say he went mad with grief, walked into the mountains, and never came back. That was near 10 years ago." Martha's throat tightened. She thought of the sadness in those watchful eyes, the gentleness in those scarred hands. How terrible! "World's full of terrible things," her father said, "and terrible loneliness. You remember that, Martha? Sometimes the strongest people are carrying the heaviest burdens." The first snow came early that year, heavy and relentless. Samuel's cough improved with the mountain medicine, but food grew scarcer. Martha's father came home from the mine with news that made her stomach drop. "They're cutting wages," he said, his voice defeated. "Silver's running out. Half the men are leaving for California. I don't know how we'll make it through winter, daughter." Martha looked at Samuel, sleeping peacefully in the corner, his small chest rising and falling with healthy breath. She'd promised to care for him, to keep him safe. She wouldn't break that promise. "I'll find a way," she said. But the town had turned its back on her completely now. The women whispered that she was a fool, wasting away to feed a child that wasn't even hers. The men laughed at the idea of her taking a husband. Who would want her now, saddled with another man's burden? "You should give him up," Mrs. Henderson told her at the general store. "Send him to Silver Falls before you both starve. It's the merciful thing." "Mercy isn't abandoning those who need us," Martha replied, her voice shaking but firm. "It's standing by them, no matter the cost." She left the store with her head high, but her heart heavy. She had barely enough coin for a week's worth of flour. After that, the answer came from an unexpected direction. She found a deer quarter hanging from her father's porch the next morning, fresh killed and cleaned. A week later, a cord of split firewood appeared beside their cabin, then a sack of winter apples, another of dried beans. Each gift appeared in the night, with no note, no explanation. "It's him," her father said, "the mountain man. He's watching over you." Martha felt something warm unfurl in her chest. Gratitude, yes, but something else too. Something she didn't dare name. She tried to catch him, to thank him. She left the cabin at odd hours, kept watch from the window, but Ethan Cole moved like smoke through the forest, invisible when he wished to be. Then, one bitter December evening, everything changed. Martha had taken Samuel to gather pine cones, a simple task she thought safe, so close to town. But the child, energetic and curious, had run ahead, chasing a rabbit into a thicket. She heard him scream, a sound that turned her blood to ice. She crashed through the underbrush, thorns tearing at her clothes, her breath coming in panicked gasps. She found Samuel cornered against a rocky outcrop, a massive black bear rising on its hind legs before him, roaring its territorial fury. Martha didn't think. She grabbed a fallen branch and charged forward, screaming, placing herself between the child and the bear. The bear dropped to all fours, its eyes fixed on her now, and she realized with terrible clarity that she was about to die. The branch in her hands felt like a twig. The bear was enormous, wild, hungry from a lean autumn. It charged. Martha closed her eyes, pulling Samuel tight against her, waiting for the impact. It never came. Instead, she heard a roar, human, primal, furious. Her eyes flew open to see Ethan Cole grappling with the bear, his knife flashing in the fading light. It was over in seconds, or hours, she couldn't tell. Time seemed to stop and stretch as the mountain man fought with savage efficiency, using the bear's own weight against it, driving his blade deep and true. When the bear finally collapsed, Ethan stood over it, breathing hard, covered in blood, his own and the animal's. He turned to Martha, his eyes wild with adrenaline and something fiercer. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice raw. Martha shook her head, unable to speak, still clutching Samuel, who sobbed against her shoulder. Ethan crossed to them in 2 strides, kneeling down to check Samuel for injuries with surprisingly gentle hands. Satisfied the boy was unharmed, he looked up at Martha, and she saw something break in his expression. The careful walls he'd built around himself crumbling. "You could have died," he said hoarsely. "You stepped between a bear and its territory to save him." "He's mine to protect," Martha whispered. "He's all I have." "That's not true." Ethan's voice was rough, urgent. "You have more than you know. You have a strength that puts every man in that coward's town to shame. You have a heart bigger than these mountains. You have—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "You have me, if you want me." Martha stared at him, not understanding. "What?" Ethan took a shaking breath. "I've been watching you for weeks. Watching you care for that boy with nothing but love and determination. Watching you face down a town that treats you with contempt and respond with grace. Watching you give everything you have, ask for nothing in return." He shook his head. "You remind me of her, my wife. She had that same fierce love, that same unwavering devotion. I thought I'd never see it again. Thought I'd never want to." Martha's heart was pounding now, hope warring with disbelief. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I can't watch from the shadows any more," Ethan said. "Because winter's coming hard, and you can't survive it alone. Because that boy deserves better than slow starvation in a town that doesn't want him." He paused, then spoke words that changed everything. "Because I'm tired of being alone, and maybe you are too." Tears spilled down Martha's cheeks. "No one wants me. The whole town has made that clear. I'm not what men look for. I'm not beautiful or delicate or—" "You're perfect," Ethan interrupted, his voice fierce. "You're exactly what I need, what Samuel needs. A woman who knows how to fight, how to endure, how to love without conditions." He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. "Come with me, to my cabin in the mountains. Let me provide for you and the boy. Let me give you the protection you've earned 100 times over." "Why?" Martha whispered. "Why would you do this?" "Because 10 years ago I lost everything," Ethan said quietly, "and I swore I'd never risk that pain again. But watching you, seeing your courage, your kindness. You've made me remember that living isn't the same as being alive, and I want to be alive again. With you, with him." He reached out, his rough hand cupping her face with infinite gentleness. "If you'll have me?" Martha looked at this man, this stranger who had become her silent guardian, who had just risked his life for hers, who was offering her something she'd never dared dream of, a home, a family, a future. "Yes," she breathed, "yes." But before she could say more, Samuel's frightened voice cut through the moment. "Martha, I'm cold." The spell broke. Ethan immediately shed his fur coat, wrapping it around the shivering child. "We need to get him warm. My cabin's an hour from here. Can you make it?" Martha nodded, and they began the trek through the darkening forest, Ethan carrying Samuel, Martha following close behind. The path grew steeper, the snow deeper, but Ethan moved with the confidence of a man who knew every rock and root of these mountains. His cabin, when they finally reached it, took Martha's breath away. It wasn't the rough shack she'd expected, but a solid, well-built structure with glass windows, a massive stone fireplace, and rooms that spoke of a man who'd once known civilization. Inside, everything was neat and orderly, shelves of provisions, furs piled for warmth, books on a small table near the window. "It's beautiful," Martha said softly. "It's lonely," Ethan replied, setting Samuel down near the fire he was building. Or it was. He worked efficiently, getting the fire roaring, heating water for tea, pulling out dried venison and bread from his stores. Samuel ate ravenously, his fear forgotten in the warmth and safety of the cabin. Martha watched Ethan move around his space, saw the way he glanced at the boy with something like longing, and understood. He wasn't just offering her a home. He was asking her to help him heal. That night, after Samuel fell asleep in a nest of furs, Martha and Ethan sat by the fire and talked. Really talked, in a way Martha had never talked to anyone. He told her about his wife, about his daughter who'd lived only 18 months, about the guilt that had driven him into the wilderness. "I wasn't there," he said, his voice breaking. "I was hunting, trying to put away meat for winter, and they died alone, scared. I failed them." "You didn't fail them," Martha said firmly. "Tragedy isn't failure. You loved them the best way you knew how. That's not failure, that's devotion." Ethan looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "How can you be so kind? After everything you've endured, the mockery, the rejection, how do you still have room in your heart for compassion?" Martha smiled sadly. "Because cruelty doesn't heal cruelty. Because someone once told me that the strongest people carry the heaviest burdens. And because—" She paused, gathering her courage. "Because I know what it's like to feel unwanted, to be told you're not enough, that you'll never be enough, and I wouldn't wish that pain on anyone." Ethan reached across the space between them and took her hand. His palm was rough, calloused, warm. "You are enough," he said. "You're more than enough. You're everything." Martha wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this moment was real, that it wouldn't vanish like morning mist. But fear held her back. Fear that she'd wake up and find this was just another cruel dream. As if sensing her doubt, Ethan squeezed her hand. "Stay," he said simply, "just for tonight. Let me prove that this is real, that I mean what I say." So she stayed. The next morning, Martha woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Samuel was already up, chattering excitedly to Ethan about the animal tracks in the snow outside. In the golden morning light streaming through the windows, watching this scarred mountain man patiently explaining the difference between deer and elk prints to an enchanted child, Martha felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. But hope, she'd learned, was a fragile thing. 3 days later, when they ventured back to Dry Creek so Martha could collect her things and explain her decision to her father, the town erupted. "You're leaving?" her father asked, his voice thick with emotion. "With him?" "Yes, Papa," Martha said gently. "He's offering us a life, safety. I can't pass that up, not for me, not for Samuel." Her father looked at Ethan, who stood silent and watchful in the cabin doorway. "You'll take care of her? Protect her?" "With my life," Ethan said simply. Her father nodded slowly. "Then you have my blessing. God knows this town never gave her anything but heartache." But the rest of Dry Creek wasn't so accepting. Led by Mrs. Henderson and several of the more vocal townswomen, a group gathered outside the cabin, their voices rising in righteous indignation. "It's indecent," Mrs. Henderson declared. "An unmarried woman living in sin with a wild man in the mountains. She's corrupting that poor orphan boy. Someone should alert the territorial marshal." Martha felt her courage wavering under the onslaught of judgment. This was what she'd feared, the condemnation, the scandal, the vindication of every cruel word they'd ever spoken about her. But then Ethan stepped forward, placing himself between Martha and the crowd. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who'd faced down worse than gossip. "This woman has shown more courage and character than any of you," he said, his words cutting through the noise like a blade. "She took in a child you all abandoned. She worked herself to exhaustion while you mocked her. She faced down a bear to protect him while you sat safe in your homes, judging her worth. That doesn't give her the right to—" Mrs. Henderson began. "I'm not finished." Ethan's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Every one of you has failed her, failed to see her value, her strength, her goodness. You don't deserve her presence, her labor, or her kindness, and you certainly don't get a say in her future." He turned then, looking at Martha with such intensity that her breath caught. "But if it's propriety you want, if it's respectability that will silence your wagging tongues and let her leave in peace, then so be it." He dropped to one knee right there in the snow, in front of the whole town, and took Martha's hand. "Martha, I'm not good with pretty words. I'm not a gentleman or a scholar. I'm just a broken man who found something worth living for again. You and that boy, you've given me a reason to come down from the mountain. You've made me remember what it feels like to hope for tomorrow." Tears streamed down Martha's face as he continued. "No one wants me," he said, echoing words he'd heard her speak to herself in unguarded moments. "But I can raise your child. I can protect you both, provide for you, cherish you the way you deserve. I can give you my name, my home, my heart, all of it, if you'll have me." The crowd had gone silent, watching with shock and something that might have been shame. Ethan's eyes never left Martha's face. "Then marry me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not because of what they think, not for propriety or scandal. Marry me because I love you, because I've loved you since I watched you choose that boy over your own comfort, because I want to spend whatever years I have left proving that you are wanted, you are valued, you are loved beyond measure." Martha couldn't speak. The words wouldn't come past the sob in her throat, so instead She dropped to her knees in the snow beside him and kissed him, awkwardly, desperately, with all the longing and hope and fear that had built up in her heart. When they finally broke apart, Samuel was cheering, her father was crying, and even some of the townswomen looked moved. The town minister, witnessing the whole scene, stepped forward with a small smile. "Well," he said, "seems like a wedding is in order, unless anyone has objections." He looked pointedly at Mrs. Henderson, who had the grace to look away. They were married that afternoon in the small church, with her father and Samuel as witnesses. Martha wore her only good dress, and Ethan wore clothes borrowed from the general store. He'd come to town in furs and had nothing suitable for a wedding. But as they spoke their vows, as Ethan slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, another unexpected gift from her teary-eyed father, Martha knew that this moment was more real, more meaningful than any elaborate ceremony could have been. "I promise to honor you," Ethan said, his voice steady and sure, "to protect you, provide for you, and remind you every day that you are wanted, you are valued, you are loved." "I promise to stand beside you," Martha replied, her own voice stronger than she'd expected. "To help you heal, to build a life together, to love you and Samuel with everything I have." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, when Ethan kissed her with tender reverence, Martha felt the final walls around her heart crumble. This was real. This was hers. This was home. They left Dry Creek the next morning before dawn, with Samuel nestled between them on Ethan's horse. Her father had hugged her tight, whispered that he was proud of her, and pressed a small bag of coins into her hands. His life savings, he said, for emergencies. "Be happy, daughter," he'd said. "You've earned it 1,000 times over." As they climbed into the mountains, the sun rising behind them, Martha looked back one last time at the town that had rejected her. She felt no bitterness, no anger, only relief and gratitude that her path had led her here, to this man, this child, this new beginning. The winter that followed was the harshest in memory, but Martha barely noticed. The cabin was warm, the stores were plentiful, and every day brought new joys. She taught Samuel his letters using Ethan's books. Ethan taught her to track animals, to read the weather, to move through the forest with confidence. Together, they built a life that was rough and simple, but filled with more love than Martha had ever known. There were hard moments, too, nights when Ethan woke screaming from nightmares of fire and loss, days when Martha struggled with the physical demands of mountain life, times when Samuel cried for a mother he couldn't remember, but they faced each challenge together, supporting each other, learning that family wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up day after day with open hearts and willing hands. One evening in late winter, as they sat by the fire after putting Samuel to bed, Ethan pulled Martha close. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Leaving the town, marrying me, choosing this life?" Martha looked around the cabin, at the herbs drying from the rafters, the fur blankets they'd sewn together, the small wooden horse Ethan had carved for Samuel. She thought of the laughter that filled these walls now, the safety, the belonging. "No," she said simply, "this is where I was always meant to be, with you, with Samuel, with this life we're building together." Ethan kissed her forehead, and she felt him smile against her skin. "You saved me," he murmured. "You know that. I thought I was just surviving up here, waiting to die, but you showed me how to live again." "We saved each other," Martha corrected. That's what family does. As spring approached and the snow began to melt, revealing green shoots and early wild flowers, Martha discovered she was pregnant. The news terrified and delighted her in equal measure. She thought of Ethan's lost daughter, of his fear, and worried how he would react. But when she told him, his face transformed with such pure joy that all her fears dissolved. "A child," he whispered, his hand resting gently on her still flat belly. "Our child. Martha, I don't have words." "Then don't speak," Martha said, smiling through her tears. "Just hold me." And he did, there in the clearing outside their cabin, with Samuel playing nearby and the mountains standing sentinel around them. He held her as if she were precious beyond measure, as if she were the answer to every prayer he'd forgotten he knew how to speak. The baby, a girl they named Hope, was born in the early autumn, with an old medicine woman from a distant settlement attending the birth. She was healthy and strong, with her father's dark hair and her mother's bright eyes. Samuel was enchanted with his new sister, carefully helping to rock her cradle and singing made-up songs to make her smile. One afternoon, as Martha nursed Hope while watching Ethan teach Samuel to fish in the nearby stream, she was struck by the impossible beauty of her life. A year ago, she'd been the rejected girl of Dry Creek, mocked and pitied, seemingly destined for a life of loneliness and servitude. Now she was a wife, a mother, a woman who had found not just acceptance, but deep, abiding love. Her father visited that winter, making the difficult journey with supplies and news from town. He looked older, more tired, but his eyes lit up when he saw his daughter's happiness, when he held his granddaughter, when he watched Martha and Ethan move around each other with the easy familiarity of partners who truly knew and cherished one another. "You were right to leave," he told her on his last evening. "This is where you belong. I see it in your eyes. You're finally free." "I am," Martha agreed. "But, Papa, you could stay. There's room here. You don't have to go back to the mines, to that empty cabin." Her father smiled sadly. "My time's almost done, daughter. I feel it in my bones. But I'll die easier knowing you found this, knowing you're loved and protected, that your children will grow up strong and safe." He left the next morning, and Martha watched him go with tears streaming down her face, somehow knowing she'd never see him again. He died that spring, peacefully in his sleep, according to the letter that reached them months later. She mourned him deeply, but also felt grateful that he'd lived long enough to see her happiness, to know that his daughter had found her place in the world. Years passed, each one layering new memories onto their growing story. Samuel grew tall and strong, learning all of Ethan's skills with the dedication of a son honoring his father. Hope became a wild, fearless child who climbed trees and tracked rabbits and filled the cabin with laughter. 2 more children followed, twin boys who kept everyone constantly busy and constantly entertained. Martha's body changed with the years and the children, but Ethan never stopped looking at her as if she were the most beautiful thing in his world. He told her often, in words and actions, that she was wanted, valued, loved. And gradually, Martha came to believe it, not just in her mind, but deep in her bones where the old wounds had lived. She learned that beauty wasn't a single form or shape, but rather the light that came from being loved and loving in return. She learned that worth wasn't determined by others' judgment, but by the courage to keep showing up, keep trying, keep choosing kindness even when the world was cruel. She learned that sometimes the life you're meant for looks nothing like what you imagined, and that's precisely what makes it perfect. One evening, when Samuel was 15 and preparing to take his own claim in a nearby valley, when Hope was 12 and already skilled in mountain medicine, when the twins were rambunctious 7-year-olds who exhausted everyone, Martha and Ethan stole away for a rare moment alone. They walked to the ridge above their cabin, the same place where Ethan had first killed the bear, where everything had begun. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the valley below was green with summer growth. "Do you remember what you said to me?" Ethan asked, his arm around her waist. "That night, when you offered to raise Samuel?" Martha smiled. "I said no one wanted me, but I could raise your child. And do you know what I thought when you said that?" "What?" Ethan turned to face her, his weathered face tender with emotion. "I thought, this woman has no idea how extraordinary she is, how desperately I want her, how she's exactly what I've been searching for without knowing I was searching at all." Martha's eyes filled with tears, happy ones this time. "You saved me," she whispered, "from a life of loneliness and rejection, from believing I was worthless." "No," Ethan said firmly, "you saved yourself. You chose love over bitterness. You chose courage over fear. You chose to see possibility where others only saw limitation. I just had the profound good fortune to be there when you did, and the wisdom to recognize a miracle when I saw one." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, with the ease of long familiarity, but still with that spark of wonder that had never quite faded. "Then marry me," Martha said, echoing his proposal all those years ago. Ethan laughed, confused. "We are married." "I know, but marry me again, every day. Choose me again and again the way I choose you. Promise me that no matter how many years we have left, we'll never stop choosing each other." "I promise," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every day, every moment, for as long as I draw breath, I choose you, Martha Cole, today and always." They stood there as the sun set, wrapped in each other's arms, while below them their children's laughter drifted up through the evening air. And Martha thought about that girl she'd been, lonely, rejected, convinced she was unwanted, and wished she could tell her younger self what she knew now, that sometimes the life you're rejected from isn't the life you were meant for anyway, that sometimes the people who see your worth are the ones worth keeping, that sometimes love finds you not despite your perceived flaws, but because of the very qualities others failed to appreciate. She'd been told no one wanted her, but she'd been wanted all along, by a child who needed her fierce protectiveness, by a man who needed her gentle strength, by a life that was waiting in the mountains for her to be brave enough to claim it. And oh, how grateful she was that she'd had the courage to say yes. Years later, when Martha was an old woman with silver hair and grandchildren playing around her cabin, visitors would sometimes ask her about her life. They'd heard the stories, they said, the obese girl who'd been rejected by her town, the mountain man who'd swept her away, the life they'd built in the wilderness. Was it a fairy tale, they'd ask? Did he really say, "Then marry me and solve all your problems"? Martha would smile her gentle smile and shake her head. "Marriage didn't solve anything," she'd say. "It gave us the partnership to face our problems together. Ethan didn't rescue me. We rescued each other, and it wasn't always easy. There were hard winters and sick children and moments of doubt and fear, but we had something stronger than perfection. We had commitment, respect, and a love that grew deeper with every challenge we overcame. She'd pause, looking out at the mountains that had been her home for so many decades. The fairy tale wasn't that someone wanted me despite what I looked like, she'd continue. The fairy tale was learning that I had always been enough exactly as I was, that my worth wasn't determined by others' limited vision, but by my own choices, my own courage, my own capacity for love. And then she'd pull her grandchildren close and tell them the story again, not as a tale of rescue, but as a story of two broken people who found healing in each other, who built something beautiful from their shared scars, who proved that family isn't about perfection, but about showing up day after day with open hearts and willing hands. Remember, she'd tell them, her voice still strong despite her years, you are always enough. You're always worthy of love. And sometimes the life you're meant for looks nothing like what you imagined. And that's precisely what makes it perfect. The story of Martha and Ethan became legend in those mountains, passed down through generations, not as a tale of beauty and rescue, but as something more powerful, a testament to the strength of choosing love over judgment, courage over fear, hope over despair. And in the cabin where they'd built their life, where their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would continue to live, there hung a simple wooden plaque that Ethan had carved in those early years. It bore only a few words, but they held the truth of everything they'd built together. No one wanted me, but I can raise your child. Then marry me. And so we chose each other, today and always. It was enough. It was everything. It was their story, and it was true.